We are now live on YouTube with the September 25th edition of the Node.js modules team. We've got 7 people on the call. We're all excited to talk about modules, what works, what doesn't work, what's working, what isn't working. Speaking about things that aren't working, let's hop right into our first agenda item. Global should be wrapped to stay in sync with ESM. I don't see Brad on here. Guy, would you want to take this one?
I can give it a go unless you want to do it.
I'm just gonna ping Brad and see if he's gonna join. I have a slight concern that I may not be accurate in the way in which I describe this one. I could talk about the meta problem that we're having here, and then we can kind of work towards the specifics.
That sounds like a good way.
So this issue is from the Node.js project. Also, is anyone able to help with taking notes? Anyone? Bueller, please, someone. So I started playing with removing the flag, and there was kind of like a bit of an unexpected issue with this, and Brad's on his way, so he can get into the specific once he joins. But essentially, one of the challenges that we ran into, which we were not expecting, was that with the way that the flag worked, the flag actually changes the bootstrap of Node itself. And in changing the bootstrap of Node, it changes some behavior, and specifically, and this is something that Brad can chime in on, it starts using proxies for the access to built-ins so that we can keep them in sync between CommonJS and ESM. So when I did the experiment of just like removing the flag and running the test suite, a bunch of tests from Node core started failing. And so Brad opened this PR to try to fix that, specifically making sure that the globals were wrapped to stay in sync with ESM. And that resulted in a -1 from Mateo upstream, specifically for performance concerns. So there are some like high-level questions about how we want to handle built-ins, named exports for built-ins, and keeping things in sync, and how we want to do that in a way that's not going to overtly affect performance. Brad, can you take this one?
Sure. There's also an added thing here that was uncovered. One of the tests had a getter fired that threw an error on a built-in. And so these proxies have to eagerly inspect all the built-ins. So if you were to create a getter or use a getter on any built-in that would throw by accessing it, who knows why, deprecation or something. I think InSolid from NodeSource actually had a mode where you could disable certain built-in APIs with that effect. These proxies would throw when you install that getter. So it would throw pretty much before it's meant to, as was the case in a test. So we need to do a couple things here. We need to discuss how to get away from the -1. Performance-wise, it seems like the main concern from Mateo is process.nextTick is a very, very hot API, and having get access to it slow down is prohibitively bad, such that he would rather we not land the proxy. So we can take a few different approaches to this. We could disable importing the process module. There's a global called process you could access. For that, we could allow the process global to go out of sync with the ES module named exports. I don't know of anybody who's vying for that currently. Or we could remove named exports from the process built-in. Finally, we could just remove named exports from everything.
Brad, wasn't there also the option? Wasn't there also the option of not having the process object and the buffer object importable?
That's what I meant by not having import work on them.
Okay, cool. Sorry, misunderstood.
Yeah. So I got like 4 options. One doesn't seem appealing to anybody. So really it's like 3 options. I don't have super strong feelings on any of this. So we just have to come to an agreement on what we want to do. As for the eager error, we literally have to just accept that we are effectively banning getters that throw on all built-ins forever as we use these proxies.
On that topic, and maybe that should be separated from the main discussion, but I mean, if the proxy's got a trap for defined property, then it should be possible to support deprecation throws through that trap as well and make sure we don't do those error cases. So working around that sort of thing and working out the right workaround sounds like it's feedback into the process.
So the problem there is when we update the module namespace, we don't have any hook to know when somebody's reading a variable off the module namespace. So we can't.
Right, but if the error is caught, it can then just be ignored. And yes, you assume idempotence, but it's probably preferable to throwing early.
I think most of the installations, like in Solid, were intentionally throwing to kill or cause errors. That seems to go against the intention. But we have a hand up.
So you're saying you wouldn't actually be able to trap those errors?
You could, but you'd probably break stuff still.
I think it's about worth like testing that sort of thing and just finding the right balance. Maybe defined property shouldn't be trapped or those sort of things. I don't know.
We have to trap both define property and set. I don't know how we could actually keep them in sync otherwise.
Just interrupting for 1 second. Jan has their hand up.
Yeah, I think the discussion about how to make the proxy work interesting from a technical point of view, but it sounds like we at some point will have to either disallow certain operations, especially when it comes to defining custom properties and stuff, or we have to risk that named exports get out of sync. I don't see a very clear, reliable path around that. And with that in mind, and also just from an API design point of view, for me, process and buffer were always built-in modules were exporting objects or constructors, so they only had a default export. So I think it doesn't feel like a big loss to lose named export support for process or for buffer. It feels like something where I would expect that I only have the default anyhow. It's not like FS where read file is a function. So I think that path seems relatively safe and relatively easy. So I think it doesn't seem like a bad option.
To clarify, are you advocating for not having named exports?
Not having named exports for process and buffer where I wouldn't expect named exports as a user.
Okay.
And I guess the challenge with that, which I don't necessarily have the answer for, but it just seems really unergonomic to have like only 2 APIs that are built-ins not have that.
Well, it's the 2 APIs that also have weird globals, like process.pit being exposed as a export by a module, but then you can also use a global to modify it. Seems very weird from an ergonomics perspective as well.
Well, and I guess, and that's something that we had discussed, that, you know, perhaps the alternative was simply banning import of those 2 built-ins. and essentially having people use the global. Because I think, and Brad can chime in on this, and then Salah has their hand up, but Brad did some ecosystem searching, and there's, at least for process, very few instances of people using require process. Most people are just using the global object.
Correct. That's not true for buffer, though.
Salah?
Yeah, so in terms of importing process, if we're going to do any kind of security, selective exports from process at some point, it might be a better practice to actually have people import particular things from process. So what I'm trying to get at is that maybe since process is really kind of like an instance of a class, you don't want to be having that as the exports namespace of a module per se. So the fact that it is like that in the require system or in the common JS system, that's fine. But you probably want to just selectively export particular things from process. I'm not sure about buffer. I don't use that. So but at least for process, you want to selectively export, so like a wrapper module around it.
Guy?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, the converse argument to that could be that it's easier to deprecate through getters like we do currently in Node.js. And if we're using named exports, it becomes much harder to know how to deprecate APIs, because you have these long-lasting guarantees that you'll be able to import something, because if it's not there, it's not just a catchable error unless you're using dynamic import. But I would very much be for keeping the ability to import process and buffer. And mainly for the reason that I think, like, if you've got environments that want to be able to not assume globals, then it's nice to be able to rely on that. It's not something I will, hold any strong opinion on, but it's just a preference, I guess.
So do we have an explicit proposal of what we want to do moving forward right now?
It sounds like there's some desire to keep them as importable. I don't hear objections to removing names exactly. There is Salah's mention of doing specific names. I'm not entirely sure what that means, because with any named properties being synchronized, we'd have to put a proxy around the whole object, which is the problem currently.
Yeah. So I'm thinking more less of the primitive type properties of process, but if there are object types, then somebody's importing a particular kind of sub API from the process object. But if it's a primitive value that needs to be synced, that definitely complicates the intent of wrapping it here.
Can you clarify? Because the problem API is process.nextTick, which is a function.
Yeah, for that, you could just be exporting a wrapper function of next.
Jeff has their hand up.
Okay.
I forgot what I was going to ask. Sorry. Could this? I guess I was going to ask, like, could we keep? So the issue is just the named exports. Like, we could make them kind of similar to common JS exports, where you can only import the whole thing and not the children, and that's acceptable to upstream. Is that correct, Brad?
I think upstream is amenable to any solution that does not slow down process next tick, really.
Okay, but that is one of the solutions that is okay performance wise.
Removing all named exports, yes.
Okay.
I should okay for performance. Not like I don't think that's an acceptable solution in the long term. Like I
Because
think
it's
these are.
because it's confusing, you mean?
I mean, like these are our core APIs. We should be able to, use them as their, they should be working properly here.
Well, we're definitely going to break the erroring getters, so I think we're going to be adding something constraint-wise that goes against existing deprecations.
Could we make these read-only somehow, and then therefore not need to proxy them between module systems?
This was talked about on GitHub in a few locations. We really can't make any built-ins non-configurable. We can't freeze them or prevent people from overriding them just because the ecosystem monkey patches so much, and so many mocking spying libraries would break as well.
Okay. I had one other question. This is, and stop me if this is like too far off topic. It seems like we don't have any better solution than the status quo for the whole named exports from CommonJS issue that we've been kind of batting around for like a year or more now. I think the only, like we essentially only had 3 possible solutions. One of them, the 2 of them like kind of depended on the TC39, and as far as I know, neither one really ever got advanced. So the third was that kind of crappy solution that I proposed, which was like, just let people define it in package.json, and then we read in the named exports from that. I don't know if that's something we want to reconsider, or if people think the status quo is still better than that. But is there something, like if we did say reconsider that and then handle named exports in some kind of lower level way for CommonJS modules, could that potentially also somehow be a solution to this?
It would still require removing the proxy. So,
well, that's what I mean. Like if we were kind of, I don't know, not manually, but like somehow from outside the object itself dealing with named exports.
Jeff, I think the challenge right now, and Brad can correct me if I'm wrong, is not a problem that's solved by like a lookup table, because we already know all the named exports statically at compilation time. So like it's not that we're missing information. It's specifically about keeping the 2 caches in sync. So I think like a radical solution, and I'm not suggesting that we do this, but an example of a radical solution, I think would be like trying to keep a single cache for everything would be an example of one that would like maybe not require the proxies, but would require massive rewrite of everything and may not even be like actually feasible based on our architecture. So I said that more as like an example, not like what we would
Although,
do.
I mean, many people have talked about how we do need to do that, like Wes in particular. And if we do have this thing where like each URL could mean exactly one thing, even across module systems, where you can't have the same thing be something in CommonJS and something else in ESM, then we could have one cache. So even if it's dramatic, it might be worth it.
For this case, for built-ins, that won't help us, at least because the built-in ESM wrappers would still require a proxy. For userland, it might work. I'm unsure.
Guy, and then Gus, and then Jan.
Yeah, sort of on this track, another thing that we can do is basically stop syncing between the ESM named exports and the CommonJS, so that when you mutate a CommonJS module, it doesn't get reflected on the named exports of the ESM module, or that there aren't like exact identity of the module object between them. We will have a way through loaders eventually to mutate the ES module built-ins, or do built-in mutation from the ES module loader side. But then it's splitting the Node.js core into kind of CommonJS core and an ESM core.
That feels like how it should be. I mean, they're static imports, not requires. I don't know. That's what I would expect as a user.
Gus? Gus, if you're speaking, you are muted.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, so back when I was adding this proxy, originally it just copied the properties like Guy said. And people were unhappy with that, but if we can find another way around that, that would like also be an acceptable solution. The other thing is that while I was adding this, I also asked as a policy that we don't add any more deprecations that fire on access. And I forgot my last point. You can come back to me.
Jan?
Yeah. I feel like we are getting pretty far into the weeds without necessarily answering the question, because I don't think that anything that we said so far changes the overall choice that we do have. Like it still kind of comes down to the choices that Bradley mentioned at the beginning. So I'm not sure if it's worth it to just see if we can get agreement. Like, for example, it might be easiest in the spirit of minimal core to say just making it impossible to import them right now until we find a good solution, if we ever find a good solution, might be the least friction, but I'm not sure.
So for me, one of the things I would very much like us to try to see if we could accomplish in this meeting, but perhaps, the meeting is not the greatest time. And if anyone has things from the agenda that they'd like to make sure that we get to on top of this, we definitely can. But basically, this specific thing is absolutely blocking our ability to unflag. And any really big changes that we want to make, if they affect core, if they affect how things work outside of ESM, we kind of need to land those ASAP. And it also raises a question that I don't think we had considered before a little bit, that if us removing the flag changes the performance characteristics of CommonJS, that, this could be considered a breaking change and could make it so that we couldn't unflag during LTS. So we are not in a great position right now. So I do know that we have a handful of other things that we've been debating and some other things on the agenda. But I think that kind of coming up with at the very least, proposal to how to solve this and bring that upstream to see if people are open to it or amenable is something that we need to do kind of ASAP. And if we want to try to land this on LTS before it goes to LTS, we almost want to get that sorted in the next week and a half. So the time is not on our side right now. So with that being said, we've talked through a couple different examples of what we could do. Does anybody want to make a explicit proposal of what path to go forward with? Guy, you have your hand up.
I'm actually not answering your question, so I'll let someone else go.
Bradley?
I'd honestly think that if we do want to unflag, adding the proxy would be problematic during LTS. I don't think removing the proxy would be problematic during LTS, if that makes sense. So with that in mind, I actually think letting them go out of sync with each other is fine. If we are looking for doing a variety of things such as polyfilling new APIs as they get added to Node. That's going to get into interesting scenarios already, since you can't add module exports after the built-ins are created. So I think having them go out of sync may be somewhat natural as people polyfill older nodes and are unable to add those named exports through the proxy. I don't think it's the best thing in the world. I think this really moves up the need to solve some stuff for certain use cases like mocking and APMs. And we'd probably want to find somebody with work hours to work on loaders. But I think, at least for me, that seems reasonable. And I can't see a clear solution that fixes all the edge cases, no matter what we do. So that's all.
Okay, Gus?
I was just going to ask if anyone knows how often APMs patch these after more than once after starting.
Extremely rare. When we did an audit a couple of years ago, there weren't any doing it at the time, but there was one who was talking about doing it.
Okay. So yeah, I'm in favor of just letting them go out of sync.
Okay, Salah?
Yeah, so just in going out of sync, for modules that will have that behavior, can we define when they actually get snapshotted? Like what state would process be in? When exactly does that namespace get created? Because when it's first imported might not always be the best strategy. So maybe we can look more into this, because it really depends if it really affects which snapshot, and then if there is any patching that's happening, people should have a more clear idea on when the patches should be applied.
So we have to do it when we first create the ES module. So the alternative is we provide some sort of mass update function, which doesn't use a trap. Instead, an APM or something would manually call it. We haven't really looked into that, though.
Great, thanks.
Gus?
I just wanted to clarify, it's not the first time it's imported, it's the first time it's imported or required. So just as soon as we create the module, we create the proxy with the known named exports.
Thank you.
Okay, so it seems like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the proposed solution would be to allow them to go out of sync. And this is only for process and buffer, or are we going to be okay allowing everything to go out of sync and just remove the proxies everywhere?
I'd prefer it be uniform, but
I mean, wouldn't upstream have issues with the proxies everywhere else too?
I think they dislike the performance hit, but it's not destroying, double-digit percentage points to wrap FS. Process next tick is pretty brutal. Matteo was saying it's above 10% performance loss across the board for apps.
Yeah, just to add to that, I do still have some concerns about the proxy, that we might discover other performance issues that we don't know about on short paths. So it does sound, if we can get agreement for it, it does sound sensible to me, to just allow them to be out of sync. Yeah.
I guess something to this as well. If we unflag, but we're not making it not experimental, and we remove the proxies, which arguably, I think that there's an argument to be made that adding the proxies themselves could be considered a Semver major change, and that removing the flag should not introduce a change like that to the common JS loader. If we do this in 12 with the experimental, like where it's still experimental but without a flag, and we start to run into like really big ecosystem issues around it, we always could, you know, change that in 13 or change that in a Semver major for 14, and handle it in an appropriate way. And future versions could be more consistent if we can find a way, if we can find a good way to do it. That was a long way of saying I think I'm +1 on just removing the proxies across the board for now. Jan?
I'm assuming, as far as I can tell, removing the proxies definitely requires a new API to resync the bindings, correct?
I presume it would add one, but it is not technically required.
Well, I mean, it would mean that any kind of instrumentation wouldn't be possible at that moment, at least for now.
I would agree with your statement. We could add something that does it, that just doesn't do it on a proxy or object model trap. So a function where you give it a module namespace that's well known, like FS, and you give it another object to sync against, would be possible still. And you could do that with a preloaded module like --require, I presume, could do that. Or an APM technically could do that at runtime, as long as we actually go and design an API that allows such.
Right. I think at a minimum, I would expect an API where I can just say resync all built-ins, and it just copies the current values of all the CommonJS exports to the built-in named exports. So I would monkey patch CommonJS first, then call this one function, and it would work as if the proxies would exist, basically. Well, for that one instance of changing the values.
Correct. That is possible to do without the performance problem.
Yeah, it actually seems like a pretty reasonable solution. Salah, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just one last point about updating. There are no built-ins where the exported names will actually change in such an update. Does anybody know of anything that currently does that? Adding new properties to built-ins?
Only polyfills that I know of.
So is there a way we thought about how ESM namespace objects can get new members on them with such an update?
They cannot.
Yeah, right.
That was part of the dynamic modules proposal.
Yeah, okay.
Talked about. Part of the complaints there is it would change linkage in an odd way where things would link at different times, and that made some people uncomfortable at TC39. And then we just never had it progress after that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so what is there someone who can take the action item of working on this change?
I can do the change.
Okay, and then Brad, would that include Guy's proposed API, or we'll do that separately?
I'm fine with that API. Seems easy enough. I
Okay.
think we do want to have a few minor discussions about that exact API design, but nothing critical.
Great. Can we get just like a really quick round of applause for Brad? And Guy, I know that you were just throwing that that API out there, but it is now canonical, and removing it would be Semver major. Sorry. Okay, cool. Jeff, you've been doing a really good job of keeping the explainer doc up to date, would you maybe be open to taking an action item of documenting this discussion in the phase 3 doc?
Sure. In a roadmap, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, you can tell me, Miles, don't delegate shit because you don't have the authority. You're just good at it. That was all.
No, I can take that one. I might need help explaining it, but I can reach out to Brad and Guy for that.
Okay, great. Okay, does anyone have any concerns with that path forward, or does anyone? I think that we do have quorum in here, so just does anyone object to Brad just sending that pull request upstream to make these changes? Okay, very cool. So we've got 20 minutes left. We've got a couple more things to get into. I think that, with the road ahead of us and the things that are going on for LTS, I do think that it would be really good for us to maybe start thinking more explicitly about a really, really clear checklist of this is what we need to move forward and building consensus around that. And perhaps we can make that an issue for next week. So as we go through these other issues, let's keep in mind and maybe prioritize the ones that are just, blocking moving forward. So the first one that we have here is number 371, divergent specifier hazard.
On that note, Miles, there's also the stuff that's under phase 3 in the roadmap is basically that list. I mean, maybe it needs a few things added to it, but we could also go through that list as well if we have time today.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's a question. Looking at these 3, then just someone please chime in really quickly. Oh, Guy, you have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, just to add another one, I actually added another issue to the agenda on the modules repo because I added the label late, but that's number 385, fallback support removed in import maps.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that kind of intersects with export maps and what we want to do about that.
Yeah, we can put it on under that topic if you've got one for it. But it would be good to get some because we want to think about how it affects our implementation of fallbacks.
Okay, so let's just go through this and then really quickly for these, if there isn't a ton of discussion, it's more just an update or explicitly if these things are blocking removing the flag, let's try to get really quickly to the heart of that. And thanks for being patient through that last one because that was intense. So Jeff, you want to quickly update us on the specifier hazard? What are next steps and what you think we need to do towards unflagging?
Where I think that left off is that we're not doing anything. I updated the docs and that's kind of where we land. If there's further improvements of it in the future, require BSM, presumably those can land after unflagging.
Okay, and is there a doc update that needs to come with this?
Well, I updated the regular Node docs, the ESM.html, and that got merged in. So I guess whenever the next release of Node is, that'll get published. I think that means we can move in the roadmap the whole item about dual CommonJS ESM packages. I think we can just move that to done, and maybe I can add that this could improve after unflagging if require VSM happens. But other than that, I don't know if there's anything else to be done there. While I still have the floor, I think we could probably do the same about import of CommonJS unless anyone objects.
Okay, does anyone want to take the action item of opening an update to the roadmap on that?
No, I was going to do that as part of updating the roadmap with the other stuff.
All right, great. And then I guess that PR can just close this issue and we can remove it from the agenda for now. Sound good for people? Okay, great. Anyone else have anything else to add to the divergent specifier hazard discussion? Nope, great. Next one up, we have loader hooks, 351. Jan, do you want to take that? Brad, who would be the best person to drive this discussion?
Probably not me right now.
I think Alex is on the call, so maybe.
Oh, great. Yeah. Alex, do you want to give an update?
Hi, yeah. There hasn't been much since last working group meeting. And so I figured it'd be good to jumpstart things again. I believe there was last meeting some communication that we wanted to happen. I'm not sure exactly what. I can go look back to some other group. And then also talks around changing the current experimental loader hook to be more in line with design doc that Bradley has written.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking I would be happy to go and work on a PR to bring the current experimental hook more in line with that, maybe get the functionality from a loader developer and loader user perspective in line with the design doc, maybe not necessarily the security advantages. I'd appreciate advice on that or thoughts on where that should go. My understanding is that we want things to be different for the unflagging of ESM, keep for sure loaders behind a flag for now, but yeah, that's my understanding.
So I guess a quick question is, like, we have the flag for the loader, but it's kind of like a flag that you have to provide anyways to pass the loader. Should we be having an additional flag that's specifically like experimental loader flag or something like that? More specifically, so that I'm not leading with the solution rather than the problem. Do we think right now that we need to have loaders done in order to unflag? And I believe that we've punted on that, but I just want to confirm.
Thought we agreed that they didn't need to be, because if they do need to be, we're not going to make the deadline.
Yeah. So with that in mind, it seems to me like perhaps we need an additional flag. And other than that, like, that's the only thing that would really be blocking for unflagging ESM.
You mean like
Jan?
a flag for loaders?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just to clarify, in theory, it doesn't have to be a second flag, right? So in theory, we could rename the loader flag to experiment loader or loader v0 or whatever. And
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good with whatever. Whatever works. Guys requesting extending this meeting by 15 minutes. I could probably stay in the space that I'm in a little bit longer. Are people able to run a little bit longer? I'm hearing no objections. Let's see what we can get away with, and we'll play it by ear. So I think let's move on to the next thing. Alex, thank you for all the hard work that you're doing on loaders here. And I think that we have a clear action item of like the one thing that we need to get in place. So
Just
the next
to be clear, that's changing the flag.
Yeah, either an additional flag or changing what the flag itself is to just make it clear that it's experimental. Because once we remove the flag for ESM, then it will just be on. And if the flag just seems like it's a normal flag, then that could give people the wrong impression.
Yeah. All right.
The next one that we have is support loading by own name. Jan, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So the current status on that is that there is a pull request for using the @ sign for self-reference. So the @ sign referring to the module that the importer is part of, or the package scope that the importer is part of. It is implemented for both CommonJS and ESM. The big controversy right now is where exactly it should fall on the precedence order. So right now it's implemented as a last resort, which means that if you have node modules /add anywhere, it will take precedent and will not ever use the self-reference thing, which is done so that it definitely does not break backwards compatibility in any case. The disadvantage is obviously that if your application has node module /add and any of your dependencies tries to use add for a different purpose, it will not work within that library because it will find your node modules /add in the tree. The good news is that using that pattern is creating a node module /add actually is currently actively broken in npm and yarn because it can potentially delete the whole source directory that add points to. So I don't think many people are using node module /add. So the discussion is both very theoretical, but also it might have an impact on how we can evolve the feature in the future. So the two options right now are basically keep the current implementation, counting on the fact that nobody has a node module /add, or choose an implementation that is technically not backwards compatible, but might be backwards compatible in practice, and that puts add as the first thing in the precedent order. So it would just always pretty much be a self-reference. It would not look up in node modules if the specifier happens to be add or add /something.
So Jan, sounds like there's good progress being made. Sounds like this does not necessarily block any of the upstream work that we're trying. I mean, any of the work regarding unflagging. And this is something that once we reach consensus on, if it lands in a way that's not considered Semver major, could be backported to 12 at some point.
Right. It kind of blocks unflagging exports because right now there's no way for a package to test exports without something like this.
Okay.
So if we are good with unflagging modules without exports, it doesn't block unflagging modules. But right now, modules implies exports.
So I guess that's a quick question to everyone. What are your thoughts on that? Do you want to see exports unflagged before we unflag ESM? Or are people open to, or let me just say, let me make a really particular one. Does anyone object to us unflagging ESM before we've unflagged exports?
I think it's worth thinking it through from a compatibility point of view, because if users want to ship exports, it's similar to the problem that we have with a gradual adoption of features to do with modules in browsers, where you have to be very careful about what features you use depending on the support. And if exports do become a Node 13 feature, then we're in a situation where we now have different mains between not just ESM and CommonJS, but different mains between Node versions, because exports is a main as well.
Okay, so perhaps we need to have one more conversation before we make a decision on this.
Yeah, and just to be clear, right now, for me at least, this PR is the last thing that stands in the way of unflagging exports basically immediately.
Okay, I guess one thing that I would say, either way though, is like, unless we unflag in the next week and somehow get this rolled in to 12 before it goes LTS, it could be a quarter to a little bit longer before this would like be considered stable and able to be backported as a Semver minor. So not to rush it, but mostly in the sense of like, Guy, to what you were saying about order of operations, if this doesn't land before LTS, we will have at minimum 3 months, most likely, probably more like 5 to 6 months of a gap. Well, could be on 13 unflagged before we can backport that unflagging.
Sorry, just to understand that you mean backporting from 13 to 12, potentially?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think the backporting will be a Semver minor. It'll be Semver major, essentially. It's difficult to know because at that point, if people are relying on the way that things resolve with modules, and then it changes, which is what exports does.
Mm-hmm.
It's divergent behavior on top of the current modules implementation.
So Guy, with that in mind, do you think that we ever can even land exports unflagged in a non-major change?
It's fine to land as long as it lands with the base implementation, and there's no, forking happening between changes.
Okay. Let's put a feather in this one and keep it on the agenda. Let's see. Jan, let's try to get that PR landed upstream, and let's try to figure this out and revisit in 2 weeks. But maybe there's a need for us to have an out-of-band conversation next week to kind of develop the strategy. So Rob says in the chat, can we ban deep imports into bare specifiers for Node 12 so that we don't incur a compatibility break?
That's not enough because exports can also override the main export. So it's no longer just for deep imports. Also, kind of going against what Guy said earlier, I don't think that there's a fundamental difference between landing exports independently and landing exports together with the ESM implementation, because exports is no longer just an ESM thing. It's also affecting CommonJS resolution. I think that the way that it is designed and with the current ecosystem adoption of exports, it's not like bundlers are already using it and so a bunch of packages might already be out there. I think it's relatively safe to add it without considering a breaking change. So, yeah.
I guess the risk is if someone publishes a package as ESM. So I'm excited about ESM. I published my ESM package. And now I realize that users are loading a file with the .js extension inside my package. So I add an exports field to the package for the new exports feature. That'll then break the previous version, which didn't use exports. So there is some degree to which I now have to think of 3 different compatibilities. What about users with exports, users with modules but not exports, and users with CommonJS and exports and CommonJS and not exports?
Yeah, I think I have to think about it in my README when I'm explaining it. That's definitely annoying. But I don't necessarily have to think about it. Like if it's already written in ESM, then I don't have to worry about explaining it to CommonJS users. So it basically comes down to, in my README, I need to explain, hey, if you're on Node version bigger than this, you can use this shorter specifier. Otherwise, please use the longer one. And yes, it means.
I guess the concern is someone else publishes their package using like the subpath for the version of the package without exports. Then they upgrade to your version as a subdependency that has exports, which then bans the subpath require. And now someone's had a dependency upgrade and potentially break. And so adding exports was a breaking change.
Yeah, I think I would expect that if somebody is publishing exports, they would make it a breaking change if they add it to an existing package. So existing users of the package, would not get it. And as for the breaking change, if you upgrade the Node version, I think that is because it adds a new restriction, right? And so no matter what, landing it in a Node version will potentially break code that was previously, depending on the fact that it could get around the restriction. So I would definitely say, I think we're being kicked out of the front room. Let me quickly move. No. All right. All right, sorry for that. So many rooms, so many people.
Also switch if you really need it. But
Hey. Okay, sorry for that. I lost Ryan, but at least I found a room. I think as long as we unflag exports relatively soon, so that there's a clear boundary for people starting to use like the nice thing about adding exports in Node 12 when it goes LTS is that is when many people will adopt Node 12.
yeah, but I guess the question here is it a breaking change adding it? I guess what you're saying is adding it as Semver minor, but adopting it as Semver major for a package.
Right. And since it is a new enforcement, you could argue it is a breaking change. You can argue it is a major change. Just because code that previously would have been able to access certain path in a package by ignoring exports no longer can do it.
Yeah, but that would be through the adoption of the feature by a project. Like simply adding exports itself is not breaking anything. Using exports is a breaking change to projects that adopt it, I guess is what I mean.
Right. And it would be, the onus would be on the packages that adopt exports to prevent circumvention by older Node versions, if they allow older Node versions.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's probably something we need to have a few more discussions about. There might be a middle ground, like just having exports as a main initially, but then there's also the cases about how that changes between environments. But I guess it gets back to this kind of not dual what do we call it, dual mode hazard, but it's a sort of a dual environment hazard. And at the moment we've got two environments. We've got Node with modules and Node without modules. And I guess the concern is that we now have three environments: Node with modules, Node with modules, and Node with exports and modules. And if you're defining a package and you expect it to work a certain way, you're going to get some unreliable differences between Node 12 and Node 13 otherwise. And depending on our timeline, it could hit some difficult cases. So we just need to make sure we're thinking that through. Maybe we need to arrange a separate discussion to actually just flesh this one out.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think for the sake of time, since we're also 4 minutes over, we do kind of need to move on. But I think that it sounds like we need to have an explicit strategy about exports and that we want to have that figured out before we unflag. Would you say that that's accurate? Okay, I'm not hearing anyone disagree. So fallback support removed in import maps. I think that, Guy, do you want to give like a super brief update? Like, were you expecting to have discussion on this? What were you hoping for?
So at the moment, the exports implementation provides support for fallbacks. And to just summarize it briefly, it's that you can either provide an exact string mapping for your exports main or your individual subpaths, or you can provide an array of mappings. And what this does is it opens up a compatibility space where we can support import maps fallbacks, as well as potentially other extensions to the resolver in future. And it turns out that import maps have now deprecated, for now, the fallbacks and built-in support. So the question is, do we still want to include this fallbacks feature or not? And if the answer is not, it brings up all the tough questions about how we want to support exports for the browser, because I think it's important that we do think about the full story there. And so I just wanted to really just, for now, to gauge opinions and just hear if people are okay with the arrays, or if there are people who think, actually, we probably don't want to do something that import maps has gone back on, and they would be more comfortable removing the arrays support, just so that we can start to work out which way we want to go forward on these problems. Yeah.
Yeah, and just for additional context for why the browser went back on the array support. So Dominic did a revised spec for import maps where he moved a bunch of stuff that was previously part of import maps to future work. So the arrays aren't gone from the proposal. They're just gone from the thing that they want to ship first. And they are now in a section about things they may do in the future, which definitely means that they're no longer a thing that will happen for certain, but it's not a thing that was entirely removed from the discussion. And as far as I understand it, the reason for removing it was, they removed the concept of standard URLs or built-in URLs. So that's no longer part of the import map story, which means that for the browser use case, they no longer have a real use for fallbacks. And also the way that the browser did fallbacks was that the browser depended on network requests for doing fallbacks. So it was literally trying one URL at the time. If it failed to fetch, then it would try the next one and so forth, which Node explicitly did not do. So I think that many of the issues that apply to the browser and why the browser removed support doesn't really apply to Node. So for me, it comes down to do we believe it's a considerable risk shipping something that might in the end be not consistent with how browser import maps work? I wouldn't call it incompatible, because I think we can always, like, given the way that bundlers work, I think that the thing that is in package JSON as an input to a bundler would always be compatible the way that we designed it with what is currently in the browser supported version. So I think it's still compatible. It might just become inconsistent depending on how the browser moves. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is, do we believe that our current design is still something that is valuable to Node? Where I believe the answer is yes for me, because I still believe that in Node, we definitely have use cases that are currently served by the CommonJS ecosystem that would be regressions to not address, at least eventually, in ESM, like, for example, development and production builds. And I believe that we have vetted the array approach sufficiently to make sure that the way that array support is currently implemented allows us to add these features in the future if we so choose. And if we don't have array support, we will not have that API option, because older versions would not understand how to do fallbacks.
Salah? I'm going to time box this to 5 minutes, and we're going to end the meeting at 1:15.
Yeah, so practically speaking, import maps is really very targeted. It's, you're in a browser, and the fact that they don't support arrays is for a very, very different, is not necessarily related to whether or not exports should have it. I definitely do agree that for Node, the array syntax does have use cases, and if you're creating import maps from there, it could be that the import map takes a string from that array. So it's just a way to declaratively indicate the specifier fallback, and then an import map would pick the one that would actually work for the target when it's being generated. So it is definitely it's unrelated to what we do, but the issue kind of indicates that the browser might not actually have array syntax in the future, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, Jan.
Yeah, to me, the browser never getting array syntax and just sticking with strings is one of the best outcomes that we can actually hope for, because that way it will never conflict with whatever we are doing inside of our arrays. And then it would just be the job of a bundler to take all the exports, resolve the arrays to the thing that actually should be resolving for this targeted browser, and write out simple strings. So that would be everything's perfect. I think the only risk would be that the browser implements arrays in a way that is fundamentally incompatible or confusingly inconsistent with our use of arrays.
Jeffrey.
I had something else when we're done with this topic.
So as far as a possible future feature, I don't think that we can necessarily like rely on that in our design space for what it's worth. But I think that like either way, the decision of what we want to support, I think, but could be wrong, needs to be able to support, the tooling use cases that in turn would then create an import map. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be one-to-one, but we should have kind of like a holistic vision there as far as like what we're supporting, and then in turn how tools would be able to take that metadata and create the metadata that we need.
Yeah, and that approach of tools taking this and turning it into an import map, realistically, that has to happen, that step anyhow. Like no browser will actually combine package JSON files. So I definitely think that we need to keep that use case in mind, but I think our current design was driven by that. It was driven by allowing tools and Node both to understand it, Node immediately interpret it, and for tools to convert it into something that a browser might understand.
Yeah, so without us trying to claim to be the dictator of the way everyone must do things, it just opens up a design space for us to create possibilities, which is the interesting thing.
Can I raise something else real quick before we run out of time?
Yep.
So I've been working on the roadmap. I just opened a PR. I invite you guys all to look at it. It's on the modules repo. I've been basically just adjusting it based on what the discussion in this meeting. It sounds like, from what I've heard, if we're going to continue development on loaders after unflagging, it sounds like, and that goes under its own flag. Continue development on exports, now and after unflagging. It's not really related to, it doesn't seem like that holds up on flagging. And I assume that the @ symbol stuff falls under that category of like, it'll ship when it's ready to ship, and it's not necessarily a whole blocking unflagging or related to unflagging. So correct me if I'm wrong on any of that. So it seems to me that the only thing potentially blocking unflagging was that topic we discussed for the first half hour, which was the proxy issue. Is that it? Or does anyone have any other items that are like, oh, we got to fix this before we unflag? Or are we really ready to unflag, assuming that, once that bug is addressed?
My impression, based on Jordan's comment inside of your roadmap update, is that he does not agree yet. I'm pinging him independently and trying to tease out of him exactly what he would object to. I think it can be fair for us to say, though, that we want to unflag, and we want to unflag maybe even by like the next meeting. So,
well, aside from Jordan, is there? We can talk about him in a second. Is there anyone else? Anyone on this call have anything that they would be like, oh, something's got to be fixed, or I'm blocking on X? Okay. I think based on Jordan's last meeting, his issue was the ESM CommonJS packages thing, the what led to the divergent specifier and led to the docs update. And he just wanted us to find a better solution than telling people to write a README. I mean, that's what he said at the last meeting. I don't remember there being any other issues that were blockers in his mind. So, you know.
What about like Wes or other stakeholders from Microsoft who aren't on this call?
We should reach out to them.
Yeah. So I'll take time to try to like reach through to everyone and try to collect all of those. Maybe we should let's open an issue to discuss unflagging and highlight all of the known issues and try to collect all the unknown issues in there. And then at least reach consensus on that list. I know it's kind of arguably what we have inside of the roadmap already, but I think centralizing that in a discussion will, you know.
Do you want to just use the PR for that, or should I open a new issue?
Let me open an issue. I'm going to think a little bit
Okay.
about it.
All right.
Okay, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for running late. Hope you all have a great day. See you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Miles.
Thanks. Bye.